Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah for Mormons. This time we're going to be doing chapter 24. This is really the last of the burdens against the nations. I think you may be happy about that. The burdens against the nations, they seem very odd to us. They seem just kind of out of place. It makes sense that most of them don't appear in the Book of Mormon because they seem less than relevant to us today. But I think that that's an oversimplification in some ways. Yes, that kind of thing is less relevant to us because monotheism is par for the course in most of the world. Christianity is a huge religion. Islam's a huge religion. Um, Monotheism is understood by a huge part of the world. But in Isaiah's time, that was not the case. So Isaiah has to systematically go through and explain Jehovah is better than all the other gods. He's not a regional deity. He's the God over the whole planet. So he systematically does this by these burdens against the nations. And that's why he has to do it, I think one reason. But that's part of why it seems so strange to us. Why does Isaiah have to even establish monotheism as being a good idea? For us, monotheism is just understood. But at the time, it's something Isaiah has to establish, that Jehovah is clearly better than all other deities. End of story. Now, we're going to have issues with that when we get to Isaiah 42 specifically, because he has to sort of strengthen his case. And that's a lot of what the second half of Isaiah is, them grappling with issues that come about because of the Assyrians almost winning. And so Isaiah has to strengthen his case about Jehovah is still the best. Don't worry. But we're looking at things leading up to that here. So people say that a lot of that monotheism stuff is later. Jehovah being identified as the best God is later. And yes and no. I mean, in this part of Isaiah, we see he's being identified as clearly the best deity. But in some parts of Isaiah, he takes it one step further and says, I've been talking about these guys like they're deities, but that's not even really accurate. I've been saying God is Jehovah is the best deity. I don't even know if we should even say that because these other ones are not really deities. Jehovah's the one that created the earth. He's the one that fills all the functions of what you might see as multiple deities do that multiple deities might fulfill in a pantheon, right? In a lot of different groups, you have a whole bunch of deities. One is the war god, one is the grain god, one is the rain deity, whatever you want, right? Well, Isaiah says, no, there is no such thing as these other gods. There's just one God, and then there's these other guys that are kind of ridiculous, and he may view them, which is something we'll see later, he may be viewing them as demons or something like that. It's hard to say, honestly, from Isaiah, but he basically says there's really just one God, and that's Jehovah, and that's the end of the discussion. The others are not even gods at all. And in some ways, this may be a response to the Assyrians almost winning. He has to step up his game one step further. We'll get to that when we get to chapter 42. But in some ways, I think it's just the logical outgrowth of what he's been talking about. Jehovah's clearly the best, and in fact, he's so much superior to these other deities that they really do come across as being totally worthless and not even really valid as deities, even at this point, even at this early stage. So people say they see a pre-Babylonian, post-Babylonian progression with Isaiah. So early Isaiah is written about 700 BC, and they say, well, the second half's got to be written way later. And I see why they think that. Without the Book of Mormon, I might agree, but with the Book of Mormon and with other revelation that we have, I think there's enough to say, no, that's not necessarily true. Um, it's maybe a little bit more complicated than what we have other scholars have thought in the past, and maybe this whole progression of monotheism towards monotheism is more complicated than we thought. So Isaiah takes these burdens against the nations. That's what this has been about, is establishing monotheism. Well, why do we care about that in the 21st century? Why do we care about establishing monotheism? Like I said, monotheism is pretty well established in the world today. But one thing that I think is not as well established in our own minds often is that we can trust the one true God. We may believe in a one true God, but we don't necessarily trust the one true God. These people needed to realize that no matter where they were in the world, God was actually the one in control, not the regional deities. And I think in the 21st century, we need to realize that even when things seem crazy, we shouldn't be worried. God is indeed still in control. Now that's one thing we're going to be getting to here. This is really the last burden against the nations. In some ways, the last chapter was, but in some ways this chapter is. This is kind of a bridge. I think this is sort of the overall conclusion to the burdens against the nations, where he takes on the whole earth, and then proceeds from there in the next chapter. So in some ways, this is sort of a bridge. The burdens to the nations, as I pointed out before, really could kind of have appeared in just about any order. I think the idea is that they systematically go through and say that there's no place you can hide in the entire world. No matter where you live, you have to turn to Jehovah, or you're going to be 100% out of luck. But here we see that the whole earth sort of is in commotion. And this sort of, I think, has to be the end of the burdens against the nations, because it takes on the whole world and sort of wraps up the whole thing. This is probably a good place to stop as far as if you were to divide Isaiah into sections. This is sort of the end of the first section in some respects. Even though the next chapter does sort of tie into it, it has been sort of tied together fairly well, sort of as far as sort of editorial unity. But in some ways, the end of this chapter is sort of a good place to stop, and then to start up the next chapter as sort of the next third of the book of Isaiah, if you were to sort of divide it into thirds. Now, in some ways, that's a little bit arbitrary. People have actually divided the book of Isaiah into thirds because of who they think has done the writing. 1 through 39 is considered Proto-Isaiah, like I've said before. 40 through 55 is Deutero-Isaiah, and 56 through 66 is Trito-Isaiah. So they divide into thirds that way. If I were to do it, though, I would say, like I've said many times, we have Isaiah, we have the guy that wrote the introduction and conclusion, and then we have the third editor. And then probably after that, we actually seem to have a couple other editors as well who are sort of tweaking the text as time goes on. But if you were to divide it just based on reading it into 3 sections, you might do just 1 through 24-ish, somewhere around there, beginning through burdens against the nations. Then we get eschatological and sort of getting them ready for the war against the Assyrians, which goes up through 42, actually, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So 25 through 42. And then you get issues dealing with how to cope with the Assyrian victory, which we get, Syrian almost victory, Assyrian victory over most of Judah, and Jerusalem gets off sort of by the skin of its teeth, right? So sort of coping with that situation that we get from really, 42-ish through the end of the book, although close to the end, it does seem clear that we're in a different situation, and that we're actually in a different setting, although they have tried to tie it together with the second part. So anyway, it does get a little bit confusing, but if you were just sort of to divide the book of Isaiah into thirds, this would be a good stopping point for the first third. And in fact, one thing I've considered is putting this together as a book of sorts. So this will probably be the end of the first book. I'll probably sort of divide it into thirds, just so that people can get whichever section they want. I'll probably put it out on audible.com or something like that, so that people can have the book of Isaiah, sort of this running commentary on the book of Isaiah, and they can have it in thirds if they want to actually get it. Now, um, so this, what you're getting here on the YouTube channel and the podcast is sort of just a preliminary version. I would like to sort of clean it up and release it as a book. I think that's probably what I'll be doing here pretty soon. So this will probably be the last installment of the first book. And I'll be tweaking a fair number of things. This, like I said, is sort of a dry run that's allowed me to sort of get my ideas on paper, actually not on paper, but to sort of get my ideas out so that I can tweak them a little bit in preparation for producing the book. So, so that's sort of what this is about. But let's just get into it and see this sort of, like I said, sort of the last burden against the nations, but sort of the beginning of something new as well. Now, one thing, of course, we always have to do, we talked about the relationship between the chapters surrounding it. And like I said, there's some connection to the next chapter, not much connection to the last chapter, although it does seem to kind of be a burden against the nations. But in some ways, this is a self-contained chapter. We've already kind of covered that. But the other thing we always have to do is how corrupt is this chapter, textually speaking? And which text am I going to be running with on this one? And I think on this one, it really is a toss-up between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. Neither of them are fantastic. The Masoretic text is a little bit better. Excuse me. The Septuagint's a little bit better this time. And once again, the Greek translation versus the standard Hebrew, right? So the Greek translation is the Septuagint. The standard Hebrew is the Masoretic text. So the Greek translation is a little bit better this time, and may be alluded to in the Book of Mormon, actually. That's one thing we always need to look at is what does the Book of Mormon say about it? Where does the Book of Mormon fall as far as assessing the evidence? And so when the Book of Mormon agrees with the standard Hebrew, the Masoretic text, we go with that. When it agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're more likely to go there. When it agrees with the Septuagint, though, we need to remember that that can sometimes happen, and does appear to be happening a little bit in this chapter. It's tentative, but it's possible. And so I'll talk about that when we get there. One other thing we need to discuss is Isaiah talking about the future. Now, I think that most of the time, Isaiah is indeed talking to his audience, so he's talking about his own time, and that's what they're going to be hearing. Now, I do think that he sometimes does allude to future events. So that those that are up on other texts that very clearly talk about future events, things like the Book of Moses, if his audience is up on these things, if his audience is up on these things, they will be able to pick up on that. But also, there are things that I think most of his audience will know when he's talking about future events, because it's just painfully obvious what he's talking about. And we do this in modern conversation today. If I am saying something and I say it's like Armageddon out there, well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It seems like the last days. It seems like the sky is sort of falling and it's really terrible. So if I say that it's like Armageddon out there, or it's like the second coming, or something like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I don't think that kind of thing would have been lost on the vast majority of Isaiah's audience. So that's one occasion where, when he's talking about future events, most people are going to understand him. And I think that's what we actually get in this chapter. So he's talking about the Assyrians, what's going to happen with the Assyrians, but he does clearly seem to be painting it in sort of an end of the world brush, right? So that basically what this is going to be like, it's going to be like the end of the world, right? And I think that there actually may be a couple tips of the hat to the Enoch material in the Book of Moses. Once again, that comes through in the Septuagint a little bit. But also between that and then also just some kind of pretty clear end of the world imagery, I definitely think that he is painting this picture, and that most of his audience is going to get it. It's not like stuff with maybe Jesus or with the Restoration, where only a tiny part of his audience probably, honestly, is going to pick up what he's putting down. In this case, probably a lot of his audience is going to understand what he's talking about. He's talking about the Assyrian Assyrian war that is on the horizon, very, very close. Um, and already they're seeing some of these things happening, but also he's comparing it to sort of the last days, which will eventually come, and I think they should be able to sort of pick up on that. So this is Isaiah 24, and it starts, Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the taker of usury, so with the giver of usury to him. The land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord hath spoken this word. The earth mourneth and fadeth away, the world languisheth and fadeth away, the haughty people of the world do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men left. So Isaiah is obviously laying it on pretty thick here. He's a little upset about what he sees in the world around him, about what's going on, and God apparently is quite upset, and he's just not going to stand for it anymore. But in verse 2 here, we get Isaiah, good old-fashioned Isaiah. In some ways, it's nice to have him back. I think that the textual problems in some of the burdens against the nations are pretty significant, because some of these guys have vendettas against the surrounding nations. So this, you may get a little bit less textual corruption, maybe not much less, but maybe a little bit. Because this sounds like good old-fashioned Isaiah from some of the earlier chapters, right? Talking about sort of this eschatological reversal. What's going to happen at the last days when the lender becomes just as bad off as the borrower, with the guy paying interest is going to be just as bad off as the guy receiving interest. That's what we get there in verse 2. So in some ways, this is something that is sort of good old-fashioned Isaiah again, the kind of things we've seen in the very early chapters of Isaiah. But in verse 1 he says, Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste. Now, one problem that we have is that there are multiple versions of the law of Moses that are floating around during this period and throughout. There appear to be multiple different versions of the law of Moses continually floating around, and with the version that we have now, and the honestly not that great version that we have now, is one that finally becomes the top of the heap much, 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 much later, after the time of Jesus, actually. We have to ask ourselves the question, what version of the law of Moses does Isaiah have? Well, once again, I think it's fairly safe to assume that Isaiah has what we would call the Book of Moses. And so, this, what we get in verse 1, the Book of Moses version of the creation story is subtly different than what we get in Genesis 1. And so, Isaiah, it's possible that he's alluding to that here. The words actually even sound a little bit the same in Hebrew. Isaiah 24:1 versus Genesis 1:1. They're not the same words, but they sound a little bit the same. And it's possible that they were more similar to the to the Book of Moses version, which is what he may have had. Either way, I think the idea is there. So he says, Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste. Now, in the beginning, Genesis 1:1, when God creates the heavens and the earth, what are they? They're formless and void, maybe? The words are hard to understand in Hebrew, but one interpretation could be wasted and empty, or waste and ruin. If I were to translate, I'd probably say, and the earth was waste and ruin, and the Spirit of God brooded over the face of the deep. Something like that. So Isaiah may be referring here to the creation. That the earth, that God made the earth, well, now he's going to unmake it. And he says, he turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Um, so this may definitely be something like the creation. He made the earth out of nothing. He puts all these people on it, but now he's turning it upside down and scattering all the people away again and unmaking the earth. So everything's going back to its sort of primitive condition. And then we get there in verse 2. Now, verse 2, he talks about that there are all these fine social gradations that they built up over time. We talked about this quite a few chapters ago. All these fine social gradations they've built up for themselves, that's all just going to be shattered to pieces. So it is as with the people, so with the priest. And people there, you might say, worshippers or sort of laymen. So as with the layman, so with the priest. As with the servant, so with his master. As with the maid, so with her mistress. As with the buyer, so with the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the taker of usury, so with the giver of usury to him. All of the fine social distinctions of one person subordinate to another. That's what all these relationships are. Isaiah says, you guys put so much stock in this, but it's all going to pop very quickly. And your happy little world is going to come crashing down around your ears. And that's what we get here in verse 2. And this is not going to be lost on later writers. Notice Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, called the Sermon on the Plain. What does Jesus say? Blessed are the poor. He doesn't say, blessed are the poor in spirit. Or he doesn't say the full version of Matthew's, blessed are the poor in spirit that come into me, right? Which you get from the Joseph Smith translation. He just says, blessed are the poor. Right? And the idea being, yeah, you're poor now. Well, someday you're not going to be. Right? This idea of leveling the playing field with the end of the world. And that's how Isaiah is painting it here. So Isaiah really is talking about the end of the world in some ways, but Isaiah, for the end of their little world, they don't have to wait very long. When the Assyrians come, society is going to get disrupted so much that the end of their cushy little world is very, very quickly coming to pass. It says, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord hath spoken this word. Now notice, once again, Genesis 1. How does God make things in Genesis 1? It's by his word. He speaks, and then things come to be. Well, God is going to speak now to unmake it. People will probably object to this. A lot of biblical scholars don't think that Isaiah would have had access to the law of Moses. I disagree. Yes, it does seem that the law of Moses, because of apostasies, we know this, that there is still the apostasy restoration cycle that goes on in the Old Testament. That's very obvious from things like the book of Judges. And so there are going to be times when the law of Moses, when nobody knows about it. There are things that seem genuinely surprising to the people. You'll remember times when the law of Moses is sort of rediscovered. And but Isaiah does appear to be familiar with a version of it. And it's things like this. The land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord has spoken his word. Everyone's going to be gone. All the goods are going to be spoiled. It's going to be sort of pillaged, for the Lord has spoken this word. Right, that does seem to be Genesis 1 kind of a thing. Now there in verse 4, the earth mourneth and fadeth away. The world languisheth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. This is a very interesting verse in light of, once again, something we get from the Enoch material in the book of Moses. What happens there? Well, the earth literally mourns. The earth weeps because of all the terrible things that are happening. And Enoch says, when is the earth going to rest, God? And God says, well, he'll get rest with the guy whose name really can be interpreted as rest or comfort, which is Noah, right? The earth is going to rest when everything gets sort of wiped off the face of it, and there's a sort of clean slate that is made. And so that's really what Isaiah is depicting here, sort of wiping things out and getting a plain slate. And that's exactly what we get there in its context in the book of Moses. So I think he's alluding to that to remind us this is the way it's going to be. It's going to be almost like the flood. And so the earth mourns and fades away, it languishes and fades away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. So once again, his sort of contempt for these people who think they're so fantastic because they have all this money or social standing or political clout, he says, yeah, you guys are not going to do so well. So 5 says, the earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they've transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. The earth is defiled under the inhabitants thereof. That word is very strong, and it's one of the interesting things that we get from the book of Isaiah, actually. And so here, as I often do, I'm going to sort of combine versions a little from the Septuagint and a little from the standard Masoretic text. And if you do that, you get an interesting verse here. The earth is defiled, and the word there is quite strong, soiled, in a very sort of gritty sense. So he's invoking the old image where he talked about the filth of the daughters of Zion earlier on. It's a very, very strong image. So the earth is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, or perhaps because of the inhabitants thereof, really, because they transgressed the laws and changed the ordinances which were, the Greek can imply, which were an everlasting covenant. They transgressed the law and changed the ordinances, which is to say, the ordinances were an everlasting covenant. Now, that's familiar to us, I think. Now, ordinances, those can imply laws, but having laws be associated with an everlasting covenant, and things that have to be done in just the right way, that's very familiar to us from multiple settings, not only the temple, but also from multiple settings. I think that's familiar to us. So what Isaiah is doing here is using very strong language to talk about what these people have done. And it says that they've changed the ordinances. And I think this might be evidence for something that we actually see really happening. We know that the law of Moses has received a lot of abuse. It's been changed multiple times and then had people try to come back and fix it multiple times. We can tell this because of the way the language is. We can sort of piece that back together using the book of Moses and also what we get from modern textual scholarship to see that people have been kind of going back and forth with the law of Moses. Jeremiah actually specifically calls people out for corrupting the text of the law of Moses, and Isaiah might be doing the same thing here. It's possible that one of the edit jobs for the law of Moses may have happened during Isaiah's lifetime. So Isaiah may actually be calling people out for tweaking the law of Moses. It's possible. So he's really, really calling them out and saying, this is going to be just like the flood. You're going to get washed away. The filth that is on the earth is going to get washed away. So that's a very strong statement, I think. And so he says that in the very next verse. What's going to happen because they've done all these terrible things? Broken the everlasting covenant. Once again, everlasting covenant is very familiar to us. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and a few men left. Um, yeah, the language here is very strong. Curse devouring the earth. Um, this is an interesting idea. Death in Isaiah, and we'll probably get to that pretty soon. In Isaiah, death is the word mot, but that's also the word for a Canaanite deity, the Canaanite deity who is the deity of death. And he swallows up everything. He has this giant mouth and he just swallows everything. So when it says the curse devoured the earth, um, he may be alluding to that. He'll specifically talk about it later on, that death itself is being swallowed up. And sort of this odd reversal of the prime swallower himself being swallowed. It says, and they that dwell therein are desolate. So everything has been destroyed. The people that are left have nothing. And it says, therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and a few men left. Presumably, uh, he may be making an agricultural allusion here, because he'll continue to talk about wine. Now, this is the very next thing he talks about. So he could be talking about when you bring in your harvest, you take the dead branches and you torch them um, during certain times of the year. In fact, there are some dishes in certain parts of the world that are meant to be cooked over fires of this kind, of dead grapevine. So we may be looking at an allusion to that kind of thing here, that um, the earth has been sort of trimmed down, and there's very few. It's trimmed down and burned, and there isn't much left. It says the new wine mourneth. Once again, we're talking about that, and so now we see probably a continuation of that here. I'll just go through and read a little bit here, next few verses 7 through 12. The new wine mourneth, the vine languisheth, while the merry-hearted do sigh. The mirth of tabrets ceaseth, the noise of them that rejoice endeth, the joy of the harp ceaseth. They shall not drink wine with a song, strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. The city of confusion is broken down, every house is shut up, that no man may come in. There is a crying for wine in the streets. All joy is darkened, the mirth of the land is gone. In the city is left desolation, and the gate is smitten with destruction. So these guys are just partying hardy all the time, just getting drunk all the time. We do that in verse 7. New wine mourneth. Presumably, they've got all this great wine, they're partying, and all these great things are doing the exact opposite. The new wine is going to mourn. The vine that usually is supposed to grow well is going to languish. It's going to do badly. All the merry-hearted that usually are singing and stuff, well, they're going to be sighing. The mirth of tabrets, and tabrets there are musical instruments. So the joy of these sort of drum-like instruments isn't going to be, you're not going to hear that anymore. The noise of them that are rejoicing, they're going to be quiet. The joy of the harp, or the joyful sound of the harp, you're not going to hear that anymore. So this contrast, the world literally has been turned upside down, as he says earlier. And by literally, I do actually mean figuratively, but the earth has been turned upside down, and nothing is the way it's supposed to be. They shall not drink wine with a song. Strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. Once again, this sort of idea of sort of these drunkards and everybody having these great sort of agricultural parties. Well, God is sort of having his little agricultural party, and it's not quite as fun as their parties. The city of and it's a strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. Sometimes, if you do alcohol wrong, it tastes kind of bad and bitter, especially with wine. The line between balsamic vinegar and wine can sometimes be a fine one, and in fact, Jesus gets given bad wine. Maybe when it says vinegar, it may be a type of wine that's gone bad on the cross. So anyway, this idea of strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. They're going to drink it, but it's almost going to be like vinegar, right? Is the idea. The city of confusion is broken down. Every house is shut up that no man may come in. So, once again, the city of confusion is broken down. That may be an allusion to what he was talking about earlier, with people actually literally breaking up their houses, and using them to fortify the walls, right? So he says everybody's houses are going to be taken away and used for other things, and um, those that are left are going to be closed up so that no one can enter. Right? They're just sort of waiting for this siege to come. Kind of a terrifying image. There's a crying for wine in the streets. All joy is darkened. The mirth of the land is gone. Everybody wants this wine. They want the good old days. They want their parties. That's not happening anymore. And the city is left desolation, and the gate is smitten with destruction. Nothing is left in the city except for these broken down houses that he's been talking about earlier in a couple chapters ago. And the gate is smitten with destruction. And presumably that is also referring to that kind of thing, that the Assyrians are literally pounding on the gate, trying to get into the city. Just kind of this really terrifying image. And he just keeps on going with it. When thus it shall be in the midst of the land among the people, there shall be as the shaking of an olive tree, and as the gleaning grapes when the vintage is done. Once again, this harvest imagery. They shall lift up their voice, they shall sing for the majesty of the Lord, they shall cry aloud from the sea. Wherefore glorify ye the Lord in the fires, even the name of the Lord God of Israel in the isles of the sea. So it's going to be just like an olive tree. You know, when you harvest, you go through, you harvest the olive trees, you get all the olives off the tree, you shake the olive tree to get it off. But then there's just a little tiny bit left. I think that's the idea, the shaking of an olive tree. What's left after you shake it? You get most of it off. There's just a little tiny bit left to get. And as the gleaning of grapes when the vintage is done, you go through, you harvest all the grapes, there's just a little tiny bit left called the gleaning. I think that's the image he's painting here. All that's going to be is just a little tiny bit left. And those that are left will lift up their voice and sing for the majesty of the Lord. They shall cry aloud from the sea. Now there's just going to be this little tiny group left. And they are going to sing. Now, that's once again exactly what happens. The Assyrians come in, they take out almost all of Judah, just Jerusalem survives. So there's just this little tiny bit left. And I think that's really what we're looking at here. A very kind of terrifying image. And so, that's why this is kind of strange. They shall lift up their voice, they shall sing for the majesty of the Lord, they shall cry aloud from the sea. Wherefore I glorify ye the Lord in the fires, even the name of the Lord God of Israel in the isles of the sea. Kind of a strange verse. So let's go to the Septuagint and see what it says. So, these shall cry aloud with their voice, but those who are left in the land will rejoice together in the glory of the Lord. The water of the sea will be troubled, therefore the glory to the Lord will be in the islands of the sea. The name of the Lord will be glorious. So that's a little bit different, and it's hard to know what exactly is going on. But remember what he talked about before? He's used water imagery before, and so I think that's also what we're looking at here. More of Isaiah's water imagery that he's bringing in to make a similar point. So it is hard to know here which he's actually talking about. Is he talking about actually this water imagery he's been bringing up, the Assyrians, like this overwhelming flood that sweeps through everything, and there are only little islands of Jehovah worshippers that are the only ones that survive, which is what happens, right? The Assyrians sweep through everything, and then just Jerusalem really survives, and they sort of try to piece everything back together from there. So that may be what he's talking about, or it may literally be the Assyrians are going to sweep in, and there's only those that can get on boats and escape into the Mediterranean or into the Red Sea and live on these islands are going to actually be the ones that survive, and they give glory to the Lord because they've been spared. But either way, the idea is that there's just these little tiny isolated pockets of people left, and they're the righteous ones, and that they've been spared, so they are praising God because He's delivered them from the Assyrians. And that's all of this is supposed to be very unsettling. This is sometimes called Isaiah's Apocalypse. I think it's 24 through 27, that area, although I might disagree with the 24 through 27 categorization, but it looks like these are a bunch of independent speeches that Isaiah has given that were sort of stitched together because they were thematically similar. He's talking about the Assyrians coming in and how that's going to be like the end of the world, and that's why they call it Isaiah's Apocalypse, is because it is very similar to the kind of things that we might get in the book of Revelation. And of course, I would say that's probably not coincidental. I would imagine Revelation draws on a lot of these images from the Hebrew Bible. But a very, very kind of unsettling image. The Assyrians come in. It's like the end of the world, and only this pocket of righteous people are left to tell the tale. But then it seems that things aren't really great for anybody. So in 16, we get a little bit more of a discussion about that. From the uttermost parts of the earth, we have heard songs, even glory to the righteous. But I said, my leanness, woe unto me, the treacherous dealers have dealt treacherously, yea, the treacherous dealers have dealt very treacherously. Fear and the pit and the snare are upon thee, O inhabitant of the earth. And it shall come to pass that he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he that cometh up out of the midst of the pit shall be taken in the snare. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth do shake. The earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, the earth is moved exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage, and the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. And they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in prison, and after many days shall they be visited. Then the moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his ancients gloriously. Now that's really does obviously sound like the end of the world. But we get some very strange phrases in here, so I wanted to explain some of that. Some of it might be clarified by the Septuagint, although it's difficult to say. Sometimes the Septuagint is a completely different version, but sometimes the Septuagint doesn't know what it's looking at, and so it tries to fix it. So it's hard to know what exactly we're looking at here. But I think that the Septuagint's version, once again, sometimes when you're going through, you want to go actually with the more difficult version that you think somebody else may have smoothed out. But then sometimes it's just difficult because it's become horribly corrupt. So it is really difficult to say. But this time I think the Masoretic text may actually be the best option here. So he's saying, glorify the Lord in the fires, although really there it says islands, even the name of the Lord God of Israel in the isles of the sea. So all these people that have been scattered onto these literal or metaphorical islands are praising God. So then it says, from the uttermost part of the earth we have heard songs, even glory to the righteous. Now in the Dead Sea Scrolls there's some a verse that talks about sort of north, south, east, and west, that all the people in all these areas are glorifying the Lord. So it's hard to know which to go with on that, but this is the same sense. So from the uttermost part of the earth, from the ends of the earth, we've heard songs talking about glory to the righteous. And he says, but I said, my leanness, woe unto me, the treacherous dealers have dealt treacherously, yea, the treacherous dealers have dealt very treacherously. So he could be talking about he's heard all these good things, that the righteous are going to be spared and that everything's going to be fine. Um, but his pessimism here makes me wonder if this isn't something that comes later. Um, because you have to recall that when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, people thought that it was going to be spared. And then when it wasn't, they said, well, why did God do this? And so a lot of later texts try to answer that question. So that may be something where people have gone back and tried to kind of clean it up a little bit. Well, not just clean it up, to try to make it match the situation. So once again, it's hard to know. It may be a combination of texts, once again, sort of the eclectic view. But it may be, he's saying, from the ends of the earth we've heard all these things. This is what the subsequent said. We've heard all these great things. Hope for the people of God, or the one who is of God. But but they will say, woe to those who reject. Woe to those who reject the law. Now that fits very, very well in the context of the whole thing. A little bit better than what we got in the standard King James Version. So then he says, fear and the snare, and the pit and the snare are upon the inhabitants of the earth. Or upon thee, O inhabitant of the earth, is the King James Version. And it shall come to pass that he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he that cometh out of the midst of the pit shall be taken in the snare. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth do shake. So here, the idea is that people are hearing all these great things that God is doing from the ends of the earth. They're hearing that the people of God are doing well. And so these people of God say, but woe to those who reject the law. And then he says, and that's what you guys are doing. If you guys embrace the law of Moses, you'll be spared. But if you cast it aside, the law of Moses will be undone. Remember, that's the theme running through the beginning of this chapter. He's going through Genesis and sort of doing it all backwards. It's going to be undone. The world is going to be unmade. So here he says, fear and the pit and the snare are upon you that dwell on the earth. So the idea is that you guys keep trying to do things your own way, but you keep getting stuck. This is really kind of hilarious. You see this idea of these people frantically running around trying to save themselves, and it keeps being a problem for them. They keep getting messed up. So they flee from the noise of the fear. They're running away from the war, and then they fall into the pit. And then as soon as they get out of the pit, they get caught in a trap. Right? This kind of hilarious image of these people frantically running around trying to save themselves. So that's what we get there in both the standard and the standard text and the Septuagint. And he says the reason for this is the windows have been opened out of heaven, and the foundations of the earth will be shaken. Now remember, God said he was never going to send the flood again in Genesis, but this is the imagery used. So he's saying, yeah, God's not going to send a flood again, but it's going to be pretty dang close. It's going to be like this. It's not going to be a flood of water. It's going to be a flood of Assyrians, right? It says the windows have been opened out of heaven. Remember, that's the phrase used in Genesis. The windows of heaven are opened, and the foundations of the earth will be shaken. It's the opening of what they call the fountains of the deep under the earth. Those are broken up. Those are opened, and then the water rushes in from above and from below. And that's, I think, the image painted here. So he's sort of recasting the flood. And this makes more sense in light of what we were talking about earlier. There is a lot of Enoch material here. Obviously, we only know that because of the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Moses. But when you know what you're looking at, you can see, yeah, there's a lot of Enoch material here. So he's really very strongly comparing these people to those at the time of the flood. Now, not everybody's going to pick up on the specific Enoch allusions, because like I said, I don't think these people are religiously reading their scriptures all the time. But some people are going to. But even if you don't get that part of it, it's very clear. Isaiah's talking about some pretty dire things here. So he goes on to, after talking about this kind of terrible destruction, he says, the earth is utterly broken down, The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. The earth is just totally destroyed, utterly dissolved, or broken down and clean dissolved, and the earth is moved exceedingly. I think all of these are supposed to be uh, what you might see in the case of a really terrible earthquake. Um, the earth is clean dissolved, sort of just undone, because it's like an earthquake, but it's almost a parody of an earthquake. Utterly broken up, okay, fine, that makes sense for an earthquake, but then dissolved, sort of undone. The earth is split apart. Um, it's some very kind of almost exaggerated imagery, but very poetic. Like everything is just shaking, everything's out of control. Once again, the earth is sort of being unmade. It's being sort of it's becoming its original components again, sort of the matter unorganized that's just out there in the universe. These materials, I think is what they call it in the Book of Abraham. The stuff, it's going back to its original state. And it says, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. That phrase, removed like a cottage, is funny. That may be an influence, actually, not of, maybe more an influence of the time of the King James Bible than of the text itself. We would probably say removed like a hut or something like that. But cottage, there was something, if I recall, it was actually just called the Cottage Act, that was supposed to get rid of all these buildings, these smaller buildings in England, as a way of, frankly, just kind of suppressing the poor, honestly. But it's interesting that they would have used that phrase. It's funny how things from the time period periodically bleed into the King James Bible. But we would say the earth will reel to and fro like a drunkard, like this sort of staggering drunk guy just about to fall, right? It says it'll be removed like a hut. You have this idea of the earth swaying like this wimpy little hut, and it's really close to falling. And it says lawlessness, that it will fall and won't be able to get up again because lawlessness has prevailed against it. It said it will fall and not rise again. So the earth is just kind of, everything's out of control. It's looking like this drunkard. It's sort of the staggering drunk that's about to fall. And the weight of the sins of it is weighing down on it, and it will fall and not rise again. Now remember, once again, the Enoch material. Enoch sees the earth, and the earth is so upset about all the terrible things that are on it. The weight of the world's sins is weighing down on the earth. And so he says, when will the earth rest? Right? And that's, I think, the kind of thing we're looking at here. Once again, the allusions are very strong to this Enoch material, this pre-flood Enoch imagery. And he says, yeah, the earth is going to fall. And this will come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the hosts of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. Now we finally get back to the things we've seen at the beginning of the chapter. Maybe a little bit of a chiastic structure here. That all these people that are so great, they think they're just so awesome. Well, they're not going to be so awesome anymore. They're going to be just like everybody else. They're going to be tossed in prison. In fact, they're going to be worse than everybody else. When the Assyrians come to town, they mostly take away, they deal with the highest level people first. They're more likely to leave peasants to just keep on being peasants. But if you're important, they'll take you away. In fact, if you're skilled, they'll take you away. We know from other records that they specifically took musicians as slaves. That was like one of the things they really loved, was musicians. So a lot of these perhaps priests who may have been musicians, or some indication of that, these guys would have been taken away. So the priests, a lot of these priests are taken away. A lot of the higher level leadership is taken away, and so all you have are these peasants. So he says the Lord's going to punish all the you guys that are on the top level of society. You guys think you're so great. Well, it's not going to work out very well for you. The host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth, are going to be gathered together in 22, as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison, and after many days shall they be visited. Now, visited, what does that mean? Well,
It's not that he's going to come back and be really nice to them. That word visited means visited with destruction. The Septuagint also talks about that as well. That God's going to smack his hand against the highest ones and against the kings of the earth. He's going to gather them together in a prison, and after many generations, they're going to be visited. Now, in the ancient prison system, it wasn't so much that you would usually get punished by being imprisoned. Periodically, it happens. Usually, though, people just toss you in prison for a little while until they can figure out what to do with you. Usually, you get thrown in prison for a couple of days. They decide what to do with you, and then they kill you. Or maybe, if you're lucky, they let you go. But that's the idea here, that these guys are in prison, but they're in prison for a long time, but then finally they do get visited. Now, the Septuagint, this is one case where the Septuagint reading might be better, and we'll get back to that in just a second. It says he shuts them up in a fortress and in a prison, not necessarily in a pit, and that's key. So in here it's a pit in the King James Bible. He's going to put them in a pit as prisoners, and then the moon's going to be confounded and the sun ashamed. And then you go, wait, what? What happened? Where's the transition there? These guys are in a pit, and then suddenly the moon is confounded and the sun is ashamed. It's very choppy. Well, it's probably not right. People probably didn't understand the words they were reading. Remember, by the time we get to the Masoretic text and even the Dead Sea Scrolls version, they don't always understand the words. Now, the Septuagint guys don't always either, but they sometimes do preserve a better version, and that appears to be the case here. It says they will gather them together and shut them up in a fortress and a prison. That's the Septuagint version. And after many generations they will be visited with destruction. Then the brick will be undone, and the wall will fall, because the Lord will rule in Zion and Jerusalem, and before her ancient ones he will be glorified. So that is very different. The brick will be dissolved and the wall will fall. Now, is this image familiar to you? I think it should be. When we go through the Book of Mormon, remember what happens when Alma and Amulek are in jail? All these guys that are kind of rulers of the people, they all get together and they all give Alma and Amulek a hard time. It's actually a hilarious chapter, right? I mean, even though the subject matter is so terrible, he keeps making fun of them, right? They do all these terrible things, and they gnash their teeth, and they make fun of them, and they look like they're damned, and then they say, "What will we look like when we're damned?" Right? Kind of hilarious. And then they all go forth and they sort of denounce God one by one, as though to show they all deserve to go to hell. And then right after that, you see them do just that. The prison topples down upon them, and they all die. The implication very strong in the chapter is they all die and go to hell, right? Now, but when you look very closely at the chapter, it jives very well with this. They're gathered together, these rulers of the people are gathered together in a prison house, and then the brick is dissolved and the walls fall. It says, and this will happen because the Lord will reign in Zion and Jerusalem, and before the elders he will be glorified. So really, this is very, very akin to what we see in the Book of Mormon. So this is one case where the Book of Mormon may indicate that the Septuagint version is actually better than the standard Masoretic text. There's actually a number of occasions where that happens. So we can't just throw out the Septuagint, the Greek version, as being just kind of this silly thing that was done later. It does sometimes preserve an original, and that seems to be the case here, that it's preserving the older version. And so these people are going to be gathered together, and the brick is going to be dissolved, and the wall will fall. Why? Because the world doesn't need secular rulers anymore. It doesn't need this hierarchy, because the Lord is the king now. We don't need all these other kings. The Lord is the king in Zion and Jerusalem, and before the elders he will be glorified. Back in the old days, the elders of the city kind of took care of everything, and there wasn't much of a unified central structure. But then the king came in, and he forced this structure on Israel and Judah. And Isaiah is seeing this system where now all the kings are going to be kaput. And it's going to be the old elders system, and they're going to report not to the king, they're going to report to the real king, who's God. And remember, we've talked about this before. This idea that in Samuel, and during the judgeship, there's this idea that God was actually the king. And when they reject that, that's a huge problem for them. They reject God from being king, and they choose a man to be king. And Isaiah is saying, we're going to go back to the old system now. So once again, very subversive, kind of fabulously subversive. That's one of the things I love about Isaiah, is he's never afraid to call out problems as he sees them. But this chapter is very very violent and very kind of unsettling. He's really painting this Assyrian conquest as like it's going to be like the end of the world. And I think that's one thing that we can see is that, yeah, he's talking clearly to his time. But I think this eschatology is really the way things are going to be someday. Even though he's saying this, and I think that in some ways he's seeing it as being fulfilled pretty dang soon when the Assyrians come to town, and in part it is, right? But I think that we can also see it and say, well, but in a larger sense, this is also going to be fulfilled later when God is king again, and there are no more kings. So once again, Isaiah's, I think we can say he's speaking on multiple levels. That on the one hand, he's really addressing what's going to happen when the Assyrians roll into town. But also, he's talking about the eschaton, and he's talking about the end of the world, right? And making the comparison between what's happening in his time and what's going to happen at the end of the world. So that idea that someday God is going to be the king, I think is very comforting as we see the world descend into chaos. That's supposed to be comforting to us. I think we sometimes make the mistake, of thinking that the end of the world is right now, like it's just about to happen. But I think that that's always supposed to be the point of texts like this, texts like the book of Revelation, is that we look at them and we say, wow, it looks like the end of the world could be tomorrow. And that was how it was read all the way back in the time of John the Revelator, that Isaiah is doing something similar here, although I don't think people are thinking the Assyrian conquest is going to be the end of the world, although maybe. But there's always this idea that the end could come very soon, and it feels like it is coming very soon. And as you see the world fall apart, you see the world be unmade here in this chapter, going back to sort of pre-creation time. When it feels like that's happening, we need to remember that someday God's going to take care of it. And whether it's in 1,000 years or whether we are kind of knocking on the door right now, doesn't really matter. God's going to take care of it. We're always supposed to feel like the end is right here, and that's not bad. I think we're supposed to feel that way. I think that's why these texts are written. We're supposed to always be really feeling like the end is just around the corner, because quite frankly, for you or for me, the end might be right around the corner. I could get hit by a car walking back to my hotel right now. I'm on a conference, but I could get hit by a car walking back to my hotel right now, and the end would really be today, right? And so even if the end of the world for everybody is not soon, by our standards, the end of the world for you might be. And so, hate to be grim about that, but I think that's part of the function of these texts, is to remind you that the end, one way or the other, the end is comparatively near, and that we should repent and not be afraid, because God's going to take care of everything. Someday He is going to be the king. Someday the corrupt system that we see around us is going to be dissolved, and God is going to take over and become king. So anyway, that's it for chapter 24. We're going to just keep on keeping on with this eschatology stuff. Like I said, 24 through 27 Although you may have noticed a seam in this chapter, it's possible that this is two sermons stitched together in one. It's hard to say, but there are some times where it feels like it kind of finishes. When you look at verse 15, it basically seems like he's saying, yeah, well, and then that's the end. We're pretty much done. Wherefore glorify ye the Lord in the isles. Should be in Isaiah 24:15, a misspelling of fires there. Wherefore glorify ye the Lord in the isles, even the name of the Lord God of Israel in the isles of the sea. Period. Right? That would be a very good place to stop that. And then in 16, we have some other stuff that keeps going, but that could be the beginning of something else, right? So it seems like these are individual speeches stitched together thematically, like we talked about before. But we're going to get more of this thematic unity of stitching together these speeches between chapter 24 and 27. So we'll talk about the unity and the disunity as we go through that. So anyway, that's it for chapter 24. Thanks for joining me today, and we will see you guys next time.